Chapter 1 7 Days Screaming. The screaming began on a Tuesday. No one remembered the exact hour, only that the sound came first as a sharp animalistic cry that cut through the stone corridors like a blade through silk. Then it settled into something worse, a sustained rhythmic wailing that echoed of vaulted ceilings and seeped through locked doors. The guards stationed outside the chamber didn't speak. They didn't need to. They knew what it meant when a prince was taken to that room by the second day. The screams had become background noise. Servants hurried past with their eyes down, clutching linens and trays, as if the faster they moved the less they would hear. But sound has a way of clinging to memory. Even in sleep, the guards would later say they could still hear it, the raw guttural pleading of a voice that no longer sounded human on the third day. The screams grew hoarse. The prince's throat was tearing itself apart, shredding with every breath, yet the sound continued. It was as if his body refused to surrender, even as his mind began to fracture. Physicians were summoned not to heal, but to ensure he would end lighter quickly. Their hands worked in silence, administering just enough water to keep the vocal cords functioning, just enough salve to prevent infection from setting into fast. This was not mercy, this was maintenance. By the fifth day, the screaming had taken on a different quality. It came in bursts, now punctuated by long, ragged silences that felt heavier than the noise itself. In those pauses, the guards leaned closer to the door, listening for breath, for movement, for any sign that it was over. But then it would start again, weaker, yes, but somehow more desperate, as if the prince had realized that screaming was the only proof he still existed on the seventh day. The sound stopped, not gradually, but all at once, like a candle snuffed out by an unseen hand. Guards exchanged glances. One of them pressed his ear to the wood and held his breath. Nothing, no rasp of air, no shuffle of chains. Just a silence so complete, it felt like a presence of its own. They waited. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then faint, barely audible, a single broken whimper. Then nothing again. The king, seated in his private chambers 3 floors above, set down his wine. He had been listening to, though he would never admit it. He had counted the days not on parchment, but in the cadence of those screams, each one a confirmation that his authority was absolute, that even blood could be bent to his will. When the final silence came, he did not rise, he did not call for confirmation, he simply closed his eyes and exhaled as if a burden had been lifted. But the walls remembered. Stone has a long memory. Chapter 2 Born under crowns. The prince was born in winter during a storm so violent that the midwives whispered it was an omen. Lightning split the sky as his first cry tore through the royal birthing chamber, and the wind howled through the palace corridors, as if the heavens themselves were protesting his arrival. His mother, pale and trembling, held him for only a moment before the infant was whisked away by attendants who wrapped him not in silk, but in hurried linen, as if touch itself might curse him further. He was the third son, not the heir, not the spare, but the shadow, the child born into a world that had no use for him, except as insurance. His father, the king, barely looked at him in those early years. There were already 2 sons ahead of him in the line of succession, both healthy, both groomed for power. The third was simply there, a footnote in the dynasty's ledger. But dynasties are fragile things. They are built on the assumption that blood will flow in the right direction, that sons will obey, that power will transfer cleanly from one generation to the next. The king knew this. He had watched his own father cling to the throne with paranoid fervor, purging cousins and uncles who dared to breathe too close to the crown. He had learned early that love was a luxury kings could not afford. And so the third prince grew up in a palace that felt more like a mausoleum. His older brothers were paraded through banquets and council meetings, their futures mapped out in treaties and betrothals. The third prince was kept in smaller rooms, taught by lesser tutors, given affection in measured doses, just enough to keep him loyal, never enough to make him dangerous. But children notice things. They notice when their father's gaze slides past them at dinner. They notice when their name is whispered with hesitation, as if saying it too loudly might summon misfortune. The prince learned to read the language of silence, the way a servant is could carry contempt, the way a courtier is smile could hide a blade. And then there was the prophecy. It came not from an oracle or a priest, but from a drunken astrologer at a feast, a man who had drunk too much wine and spoken too freely. He had pointed at the third prince, barely 10 years old at the time, and declared that the boy carried a shadow in his stars. A child born under such signs, the man slurred, will either save the throne or destroy it. The king had the astrologer executed the next morning quietly, without trial, without announcement. But the words had already spread through the court like poison. Advisors began to watch the boy more closely. Servants avoided his gaze. His brothers, once indifferent, now looked at him with something close to suspicion. The third prince did not understand what he had done wrong. He only knew that something had shifted. The palace, already cold, had become colder, and his father, who had never shown him warmth, now looked at him as if he were a problem waiting to be solved. The prophecy was never spoken of again, but it lingered like smoke in a closed room, invisible yet suffocating. Chapter 3 Lessons in Fear. Fear the prince learned was not taught through words, it was taught through absence. His first tutor disappeared without explanation one morning. The elderly scholar who had been teaching him philosophy simply wasn't there. The prince asked about him once hesitantly, and was met with a silence so cold it made his skin prickle. He never asked again. A new tutor arrived the next week, younger, quieter, with eyes that never left the floor. The lessons continued, but the warmth was gone. Then it was a servant, a woman who had braided his hair when he was small, who had hummed lullabies when the palace felt too vast and empty. She was accused of theft. A silver spoon, they said, found hidden in her quarters. The prince knew she hadn't taken it. He had seen the way the head steward looked at her, the way he whispered to the guards. But when he tried to speak up, his mother placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed hard enough to bruise. Do not, she said quietly, make yourself memorable. The woman was whipped in the courtyard. The prince watched from a window, hands pressed against the glass, unable to look away. Each crack of the lash felt like a lesson carved into his own skin. This is what happens to those who care for you. The palace was a place where loyalty was punished and silence rewarded. The prince learned to keep his thoughts behind his teeth, to let conversations wash over him like water, to nod at the right moments and never ever ask why. But even silence could be dangerous. He discovered this the hard way when at 14. He made the mistake of sitting too quietly during a council meeting. His father had been ranting about a border skirmish, his voice rising as he paced the length of the hall. The prince had said nothing, merely observing as he had been taught. But afterward, his father cornered him in the corridor, eyes blazing. You sat there like a statue. The king hissed, what were you thinking, plotting, judging? Nothing, father, I was lies. The king's hand shot out, gripping the prince's jaw hard enough to make his teeth ache. I see it in your eyes. You think you are clever. You think you can hide behind that quiet face and no one will notice. The prince's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to say, I was listening. I was obeying. I was doing exactly what you wanted. But the words wouldn't come. His father released him with a shove and walked away, leaving the prince trembling in the empty hallway. That night he stared at the ceiling of his chamber and realized a terrible truth. There was no correct answer. Speak too much and you were insolent, speak too little and you were scheming, show emotion, and you were weak, show none, and you were cold. The rules changed depending on his father's mood, and his father's mood was a storm that never passed. Fear became the prince's companion. It sat with him at meals, walked beside him through corridors, whispered in his ear at night, and slowly, quietly, it began to hollow him out from the inside. Chapter 4 Seeds of Suspicion. The letters were found in spring, or rather, they were said to have been found. No one ever showed them to the prince. No one ever let him read the words that would seal his fate. But the chief advisor, a man with silver hair and a voice like honey poured over iron, spoke of them with such certainty that it hardly mattered whether they existed at all. Correspondence, the advisor said, standing before the king's throne with his hands folded piously, with foreign envoys written in code, Your Majesty. But the intent is clear. The prince has been reaching out. The king's face remained impassive. But his fingers tightened around the armrests of his throne. Reaching out, he repeated slowly. For what purpose? Support, perhaps, or assurances? It is difficult to say without interrogation. The prince, summoned to the council chamber, stood frozen in the doorway. He felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him, felt the air grow thick with accusation. I have sent no letters, he said, and his voice sounded small even to his own ears. I have spoken to no envoys, I swear it. The advisor smiled gently, as if the prince were a child who had just told a charming lie. Then perhaps you are unaware of those who act in your name. Perhaps others have taken it upon themselves to prepare for eventualities. What eventualities? The prince's voice cracked. I have done nothing, I want nothing. And that, the king said quietly, is precisely what a guilty man would say. The prince felt the floor tilt beneath him. He looked to his mother seated at the edge of the chamber, but she would not meet his gaze. His brothers stood beside the throne, their faces carefully blank. No one would speak for him, no one would dare. Over the following weeks, the accusations multiplied like weeds. Servant claimed to have overheard the prince speaking ill of the king. A courtier reported that the prince had been seen in the chapel at odd hours praying, but to whom and for what? Even his silence was turned against him. He does not defend himself, the advisor noted in council, because he knows there is no defense. The prince tried at first to fight back. He demanded to see the letters, to confront his accusers, to present evidence of his loyalty. But the machinery of the court had already begun to turn, and it ground slowly, inevitably, toward a predetermined conclusion. His requests were met with delays, with polite deflections, with suggestions that perhaps he should cooperate. If he truly had nothing to hide, cooperate, the word became a threat. His father stopped speaking to him entirely. Meals were taken in separate chambers. The prince's movements were restricted for his own safety. They said, though the guards who followed him everywhere looked less like protectors and more like wardens. He was allowed no visitors save for a single priest, a man with kind eyes, who asked gently if the prince might wish to confess his sins. I have committed no sins, the prince said. The priest nodded slowly. Then you are already at peace. He said, that is a rare gift. The prince did not feel at peace. He felt like a bird in a cage, watching the door close inch by inch. He began to understand that guilt and innocence were irrelevant. The decision had already been made. All that remained was the performance, the ritual of accusation and punishment that would justify what had already been decided in private. One night, unable to sleep, the prince paced his chamber and asked the only question that mattered: what did I do? But the walls offered no answer, only silence, and in that silence he heard the echo of his own future, the sound of doors sealing shut, of keys turning, of footsteps walking away. The arrest came 3 days later. Chapter 5. The first night they came for him after midnight. No fanfare, no proclamation, no reading of charges in a public square, just the soft scrape of boots on stone, the click of a lock being turned, and the sudden flood of torchlight into his darkened chamber. The prince woke to hands gripping his arms, yanking him from bed. Before his eyes had fully opened, he tried to speak, to ask, to protest, to demand, but a gloved hand clamped over his mouth, and he was dragged into the corridor in his nightclothes, barefoot on cold stone. The palace at night was a different place. The grand halls he had walked 1,000 times looked unfamiliar in the flickering torchlight, shadows stretching and warping until every corner seemed to hide a threat. He was pulled down a staircase he didn't recognize, through a passage he had never seen, deeper and deeper, until the air grew damp and the walls began to weep with condensation. They stopped at a door of black iron. One of the guards produced a key, old, heavy, the kind that opened locks meant never to be opened again. The door swung inward with a groan, and the prince was shoved inside. He stumbled, caught himself against a wall slick with moisture, and turned back just in time to see the door slam shut. The sound of the lock engaging was final, absolute, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. He hadn't been allowed to finish. For a moment, there was only darkness, then slowly, his eyes adjusted. The chamber was small, barely 10 paces across, with walls of rough-hewn stone, and a ceiling so low he could touch it if he stretched. There was a single torch mounted near the door, its flame guttering, weakly casting more shadow than light. In the center of the room was a chair, not a throne, not a seat of judgment, but a simple wooden chair with leather straps dangling from the armrests and legs. The prince's breath came fast and shallow. He backed against the far wall as if distance might protect him, as if there were anywhere to hide. The door opened again. 3 men entered. They wore no uniforms, no insignia, nothing to identify them as soldiers or executioners or servants of the crown. They were simply men, ordinary, unremarkable, with faces the prince would forget. Even as they destroyed him, one of them carried a leather satchel, another held a length of rope, the third said nothing, only gestured toward the chair. "Please," the prince said, and hated the sound of his own voice, the way it trembled, the way it begged without meaning to please. "I have answered." The word was not shouted. It was spoken calmly, almost kindly, and that made it worse. The prince's legs moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him toward the chair as if pulled by invisible strings. He sat. The men moved with practiced efficiency, strapping his wrists to the armrests, his ankles to the legs, pulling their leather tight enough to cut into skin. He tried to pull away, but the straps held. He was fixed in place, unable to move, unable to flee, unable to do anything. But wait, one of the men opened the satchel. The prince didn't see what was inside. He didn't need to. The sound was enough. The clink of metal on metal, the soft scrape of something sharp being laid on stone. His heart hammered. So hard, he thought it might break through his ribs. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. Why, he managed to whisper, "Why are you doing this?" The man with the satchel looked at him with something almost like sympathy. "Orders," he said simply. And then it began. The first scream to out of him before he could stop it, raw, primal, a sound he didn't know he was capable of making. It echoed of the stone walls and bounced back at him, multiplying until it felt like the room itself was screaming somewhere above in his private chambers. The king paused over his wine and listened. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply listened, as if confirming that the machinery of his will was functioning as intended. By dawn, the prince's voice was already beginning to crack. Chapter 6: Invented Confessions. The questions came in waves, each one designed not to discover truth, but to manufacture it. Who did you write to? I didn't write to anyone. How many conspirators were involved? There were no conspirators. What was the signal for the uprising? There was no uprising. The interrogators were patient. They had been trained in a specific kind of cruelty, not the explosive violence of a street brawl, but the slow, methodical application of pressure designed to break a mind before it broke a body. They did not need the prince to tell the truth. They needed him to tell their truth, the story that had already been written by advisors and ratified by the king. By the second day, the prince could no longer remember what he had said, and what he had only thought. Pain had a way of eroding the boundaries between reality and confession. When they asked him if he had plotted against his father, he said no. When they asked again, 3 hours later, his answer was slower, less certain. When they asked a third time, with instruments of pain laid out before him, like a merchant his wares, he whispered, "I don't know." That hesitation was recorded as progress on the third day. They brought him parchment. "Write it down," they said. "Your own words explain your betrayal." His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the quill. He stared at the blank page and saw his own death written there in invisible ink. "I have nothing to confess," he said, but his voice was a rasp, barely human. Then we continue. By the fourth day, the prince's mind began to fracture. He confessed to meetings that never happened, to letters he never wrote, to conversations that existed only in the fevered imagination of his accusers. He named names pulled from memory, from overheard gossip, from nowhere at all, and watched as scribes recorded each word with meticulous care. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It only mattered that it was written. On the fifth day, the interrogators grew frustrated. The prince's confessions were too vague, too contradictory. They needed something concrete, something the king could present as evidence of treachery averted. So they began to fill in the details themselves. You met him in the east courtyard. Did you plan to strike during the harvest festival? You swore an oath of allegiance to the foreign prince. The prince, barely conscious, nodded. Or perhaps he only imagined nodding by that point. The distinction no longer mattered. By the sixth day his voice was nearly gone. The screams had become whispers. The whispers had become rasping breaths. He no longer answered their questions. He simply waited for the next wave of pain, endured it, and waited for it to end. His body had become a thing separate from himself, a piece of meat that suffered while his mind floated somewhere above, detached and numb. On the seventh day, the door opened one final time. The prince, slumped in the chair, did not lift his head. He heard footsteps heavier than the interrogator's, slow, more deliberate. He knew without seeing who had come. His father stood in the doorway and looked at what his son had become. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Chapter 7. Death without mercy. The prince died sometime before dawn. There was no physician present to record the exact moment, no priest to administer last rites, no family to bear witness. He simply stopped breathing, his body finally surrendering to what his will could not. The interrogators who had stepped out of the chamber for a brief respite returned to find him slumped in the chair, head lowered forward, skin the color of old parchment. They checked for a pulse out of habit, found none, and sent word to the king. The response came within the hour. Remove the body quietly. No trial, no execution, no public acknowledgement that the third prince had ever been arrested, questioned, or punished. He had simply ceased to exist. Servants were summoned, ones who knew how to move in silence, who understood that some tasks were best forgotten as soon as they were completed. The body was wrapped in rough cloth, carried through passages that skirted the main halls, and taken out through a servant's gate before the sun had fully risen. No grave was marked, no prayers were spoken. The earth received him without ceremony, and the dirt was smoothed over as if nothing had ever disturbed it. By midday, the chamber where he had died was scrubbed clean, the chair removed, the torch extinguished. Within a week, even the guards who had stood outside the door struggled to remember what the prince had looked like. The official records were adjusted with surgical precision. The third prince's name appeared in the genealogies, but only as a footnote. Bond lived, died, no details, no story, just dates cold and indisputable that revealed nothing and explained less. The king ordered a feast that night. He did not toast his son's memory. He toasted the security of the realm, the strength of the crown, the wisdom of decisive action. No one dared to disagree. Chapter 8. Echoes of silence, but silence, as it turned out, was not the same as forgetting. Within a year, the king's health began to fail. Physicians spoke of infections, of fevers that would not break, of a malaise that seemed to eat him from the inside. He grew paranoid, seeing conspiracies in every shadow, hearing betrayal in every whispered conversation. His remaining sons watched him with wary eyes, each wondering if they would be next. The dynasty, once unshakable, began to rot. Rebellions flared in distant provinces. Allies withdrew their support. The treasury, drained by years of lavish purges and military campaigns, ran dry. And through it all, the king's advisors, the very men who had orchestrated the prince's destruction, quietly positioned themselves to survive the coming collapse. History would remember the king as a tyrant. His reign would be studied as a cautionary tale, a lesson in what happens when power consumes itself. But the third prince, the boy who screamed for 7 days, would not appear in those histories. He had been erased too thoroughly, too completely. Yet in the palace, in the deep places where stone remembers what flesh forgets, there are still nights when guards swear they hear it, a distant broken sound that might be wind or might be something else. The walls do not forget, and neither perhaps does the darkness.